There's a photograph that haunts me. For boys on bicycles, frozen in faded Kodachrome. Their smiles so wide you can almost hear their laughter echoing through the decades. Kevin Mitchell is in the front, his sandy blonde hair catching the July sunlight like spun gold. Behind him, Darnell Patterson pedals with his characteristic intensity, always trying to catch up, always proving himself. To the left, Ryan Foster waves at the camera with one hand, showing off as usual. And bringing up the rear, looking straight into the lens with eyes that seem to see right through time itself, is my brother, Caleb. That photograph was taken on July 14, 1987, at approximately 2:47 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because my mother wrote it on the back in her careful handwriting, the way she documented everything about our lives. 3 hours and 22 minutes later, those 4 boys would vanish into the woods near Grayson, Kentucky, and nothing in our small town would ever be the same again. But you need to understand something before we go any further. This isn't the story you think it is. This isn't a tragedy wrapped in mystery, meant to leave you with more questions than answers. No, this is a story about truth, about courage, about 4 ordinary teenagers who stumbled onto something extraordinary and terrifying, and about the 37 years it took for the world to finally learn what really happened in those woods. My name is Emma Mitchell-Patterson, and I was 12 years old the summer my brother disappeared. I'm 50 now, and I've spent most of my adult life piecing together the fragments of that day, chasing whispers and shadows, refusing to let Grayson forget what it so desperately wanted to bury. What I'm about to tell you is the complete truth. Every word, every detail, every dark secret that powerful people try to hide. But before you scroll away, before you decide this is just another missing person's story from a bygone era, I need you to make me a promise. If this story moves you, if it makes you angry or sad or determined, share it. Subscribe to this channel. Because Kevin, Darnell, Ryan, and Caleb deserve to have their story heard by millions. They deserve more than a faded photograph and a footnote in local history. And frankly, if you don't stay until the end, you'll miss the part where everything you think you know gets turned completely upside down. Now, let me take you back to Grayson in the summer of 1987. Our town sat nestled in the northeastern corner of Kentucky, where the little sandy river curved like a protective arm around our little community. The population hovered around 24,000, which meant everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. The coal industry had been the lifeblood of Grayson for generations, but by 1987, the mines were starting to close down. Fathers who had worked the same jobs for decades suddenly found themselves collecting unemployment. The optimism of the Reagan years felt hollow to families struggling to keep their homes. But none of that mattered to 4 teenage boys with summer stretching out before them like an endless golden road. Kevin was 16, the unofficial leader of their group, though he would have laughed at that description. He had this way of making everyone feel included, of turning ordinary moments into adventures. When Kevin suggested they ride out to the old swimming hole, it wasn't a question. It was an invitation to the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that only exists in the summers of your youth. Darnell was 15, the son of the only black family in our immediate neighborhood. His father, Walter Patterson, was a supervisor at the regional power plant, respected by his crew but constantly reminded of his otherness in a town that still hung Confederate flags without a second thought. Darnell had learned to navigate those waters with a combination of athletic excellence and careful diplomacy. He was the fastest runner at Grayson High, already being scouted by college coaches despite being just a sophomore. Ryan Foster was the wild card, 15 years old with a reputation for mischief that bordered on legend. His father had left when he was 7, and his mother worked double shifts at the hospital, which meant Ryan raised himself more often than not. He was brilliant in a way that made teachers uncomfortable, asking questions they couldn't answer, seeing through pretenses that adults preferred to maintain. And then there was Caleb, my brother, 14 years old, the youngest of the group by nearly a year, but somehow the most steady. Caleb was the one who remembered to bring the first aid kit, who made sure everyone had enough water, who would give you his last dollar without you even having to ask. He had our mother's kindness and our father's quiet strength, and I worshipped him the way only a younger sister can worship her big brother. The morning of July 14th started like any other summer day. I remember the smell of bacon drifting up the stairs, the sound of Casey Kasem counting down the top 40 on the radio in the kitchen. Caleb was already awake when I stumbled downstairs, sitting at the table with a glass of orange juice, sketching in the notebook he carried everywhere. "What are you drawing?" I asked, still rubbing sleep from my eyes. He tilted the notebook toward me. It was a map, detailed, intricate, showing the woods that stretched behind Henderson's farm all the way to the old sandstone quarry. He had marked trails with different colored pencils, noting landmarks and distances. "Kevin wants to find the old Whitmore cabin," he said. "The one Grandpa used to talk about. Says there's a natural spring nearby with water so cold it'll give you a headache." I remember feeling a strange chill despite the morning warmth. "That's really far out there, Caleb. Mom's not going to like it." He shrugged with that particular teenage certainty that nothing bad could ever happen to him. "We'll be back before dinner. She won't even notice." Those words would echo in my mother's mind for the rest of her life. She would replay that morning 1,000 times, wondering what she could have said, what she could have done differently. But that morning, she simply kissed Caleb on the forehead, reminded him to wear sunscreen, and watched him ride away on his blue Schwinn 10-speed. The last time she ever saw her son. The four boys met up at the corner of Maple and Crawford Street at noon sharp. Mrs. Donovan, who lived in the corner house with the garden gnomes on her lawn, was the last adult to see them together. She testified later that they seemed happy, excited, arguing good-naturedly about which route to take. Kevin was pointing toward the tree line in the distance. Darnell was adjusting his backpack straps. Ryan was doing wheelies on his bike, showing off as usual. And Caleb was laughing at something one of them had said. Normal boys doing normal things on a normal summer day. Mrs. Donovan waved at them. Ryan waved back. And then they pedaled away, for silhouettes growing smaller and smaller against the afternoon sky until they crested the hill on County Road 12 and disappeared from view. That was 12:17 p.m. By 9 o'clock that night, when none of them had come home, the parents started making phone calls. By midnight, the police were involved. By dawn, search parties were combing the woods with flashlights and bloodhounds. And by the time the sun set on July 15th, Grayson had begun its long descent into suspicion, grief, and secrets that would poison our community for decades. But here's what no one knew then, what no one would know for 37 years. Those boys weren't just lost in the woods. They had found something. Something that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. And the truth of what happened to them was far stranger, far darker, and ultimately far more hopeful than anyone could have imagined. The first 3 days after the boys disappeared felt like the entire town was holding its breath. I remember sitting on our front porch, watching an endless stream of volunteers arrive at the community center across the street, the staging ground for the search operation. Men I recognized from church, women who worked with my mother at the grocery store, teenagers who should have been at summer jobs or swimming pools. Everyone came together with a single desperate purpose. Sheriff Bernard Hawkins coordinated the efforts, his deep voice booming through a bullhorn as he assigned grid sections to search teams. Sheriff Hawkins was a broad-shouldered man with a thick gray beard that made him look like a character from a Western film. He had served in Vietnam, and there was a hardness in his eyes that made children uncomfortable but made adults feel safe. If anyone could find those boys, the town believed, it was Bernard Hawkins. I snuck out on the second day, joined one of the search teams without telling my parents. I needed to do something, anything, besides sit in my room staring at Caleb's empty bed across the hall. The team I joined was led by Mr. Thornton, my 7th grade science teacher, who either didn't notice or didn't have the heart to send me home. We walked through those woods for hours, calling the boys names until our voices gave out. The summer heat was oppressive, thick and humid, and the canopy of trees blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual green twilight. Every snapped twig made my heart jump. Every distant bird call sounded like a human voice. I found Caleb's notebook at 3:42 p.m. on July 17th. It was lying in a small clearing about 2 miles from the old Henderson property line, half hidden under a covering of leaves, as if someone had tried to bury it quickly. The pages were damp from morning dew, but the drawings were still visible. Maps. Detailed maps showing trails that weren't on any official survey, including one path marked in red pencil that led to something Caleb had labeled simply as the compound. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I called out for Mr. Thornton, and within minutes, the clearing was swarming with deputies and volunteers. Sheriff Hawkins himself came to examine the notebook, his face unreadable as he flipped through the pages. "Good work, little lady," he said, tucking the notebook into an evidence bag. "You might have just given us our first real lead." I never saw that notebook again. When I asked about it weeks later, months later, years later, I was told it had been logged into evidence, that it contained nothing of significance, that children's drawings weren't reliable investigative tools. But I knew what I had seen. I knew my brother had found something in those woods, something important enough to map, important enough to hide. The official search continued for 18 days. Helicopters flew overhead in systematic patterns. Dive teams explored the old quarry pond. Dogs tracked scents that led in circles, starting and stopping with no logical pattern. On August 1st, 1987, Sheriff Hawkins held a press conference on the steps of City Hall and announced that the active search was being suspended. "We have exhausted all available leads," he said, reading from a prepared statement while cameras flashed. "The investigation remains open, and we encourage anyone with information to come forward. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families during this unimaginably difficult time." Thoughts and prayers. As if those words could fill the emptiness in our homes, could answer the questions that kept us awake at night, could bring back for boys who had simply wanted to find a cabin in the woods. My mother stopped sleeping. My father started drinking. The Patterson family sold their house and moved to Louisville, unable to bear the whispers and stares. Ryan Foster's mother suffered a complete breakdown and was committed to a psychiatric facility in Frankfurt, where she would remain for the next 3 years. And the Mitchell household, Kevin's family, became a monument to frozen grief, with his mother keeping his room exactly as he had left it, his clothes still folded in drawers, his baseball glove still on his desk. But if the families were drowning in sorrow, the town itself was beginning to simmer with something else: suspicion. Here's something I need you to understand about small towns in 1987, especially small towns in Appalachia. When something terrible happened, when the logical explanations failed, people looked for scapegoats. And in Grayson, Kentucky, the scapegoat they chose was Walter Patterson, Darnell's father. The whispers started within days of the boy's disappearance. Walter was different. Walter had a temper. Walter had been seen arguing with Darnell the week before about something at the power plant. The fact that Walter had alibis for every moment of that afternoon, confirmed by multiple co-workers, didn't matter. The fact that Walter was searching the woods alongside everyone else, tears streaming down his face, didn't matter. What mattered was that he was an outsider in a town that feared and resented outsiders, and fear needed somewhere to land. Someone threw a brick through the Pattersons' front window on July 23rd. The word painted on it was one I won't repeat here, but you can imagine. Walter sat on his porch with a shotgun for the next 3 nights, protecting his wife and younger children, until he made the decision that his family needed to leave Grayson and never come back. I watched them load their belongings into a moving truck on a gray morning in early August. Mrs. Patterson was crying. The younger kids looked confused and scared. Walter stood tall, but I could see something broken behind his eyes. He had lost his son, and then he had lost his community, and there was nothing left for him in a town that had decided he was guilty of something unspeakable. I walked up to him before they drove away. I was 12 years old and trembling with anger and grief, but I needed him to know. "I don't believe what they're saying, Mr. Patterson. Caleb loved Darnell, and I'm going to find out what really happened. I promise." Walter looked down at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "You're a good girl, Emma. Your brother was lucky to have you." He paused, glancing back at the house. "If you do find out the truth, make sure the world knows. Make sure they can't bury it again." Again, that word stuck with me. It implied he knew something, suspected something, but couldn't prove it. I wanted to ask what he meant, but Mrs. Patterson was calling him, and the moment passed. The moving truck pulled away, taking the Patterson family out of Grayson forever. And with them went any chance of easy answers. In the months that followed, the official investigation quietly wound down. Files were closed. Resources were redirected. The four boys joined the ranks of America's missing children, their faces appearing on milk cartons and poster boards, fading with each passing year until only the families still remembered to look. But something strange was happening in the background, something I wouldn't understand until decades later. Key witnesses began changing their stories. People who had been vocal about suspicions suddenly went quiet. Property records near the old quarry were sealed by court order. And Sheriff Bernard Hawkins, who had led the search with such determination, announced his early retirement just 6 months after the disappearance, moving to Arizona with a pension that seemed unusually generous for a county sheriff. These weren't coincidences. These were symptoms of a cover-up orchestrated at levels I couldn't have imagined at 12 years old. Let me pause here and ask you something directly. Have you ever known, with absolute certainty, that you were being lied to by people in authority? Have you ever felt that terrible weight of truth being smothered, of reality being rewritten to protect the powerful? Leave a comment below and tell me about a time when you knew the official story wasn't the real story. Because that feeling, that frustration, that burning need for truth, it's what kept me going for 37 years. And if my family had known what was really happening in those woods, they would have been even more terrified than they already were. 20 years passed before I found the first real piece of the puzzle. By 2007, I had become a different person than the grieving 12-year-old who had watched her brother ride away into oblivion. I had graduated from the University of Kentucky with degrees in journalism and criminal justice. I had worked as an investigative reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal, earning a reputation for pursuing stories that others dismissed as conspiracy theories. And I had married Marcus Patterson, Darnell's younger brother, who had been only 8 years old when his family fled Grayson. Our marriage had been born from shared grief and shared determination. Marcus remembered his brother as a hero, larger than life, the boy who had carried him on his shoulders at county fairs and taught him how to throw a perfect spiral. He had grown into a soft-spoken man with his father's intensity and his mother's gentle heart, and together, we had made a pact. We would never stop searching for the truth. In October of 2007, we received an anonymous package at our home in Louisville. Inside was a manila envelope containing grainy photographs and a handwritten letter. The photographs showed what appeared to be a military installation hidden deep in the Kentucky woods. Guard towers, razor wire fencing, a cluster of concrete buildings with no windows, trucks bearing no insignia, men in uniforms that didn't match any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. The letter was brief. Your boys found this. That's why they disappeared. Look into Project Sandstone. You're not the only ones asking questions. There was no signature, no return address, no identifying marks of any kind. Marcus and I spent the next 3 years investigating Project Sandstone. We filed Freedom of Information Act requests that were denied. We contacted veterans organizations looking for anyone who had served in Kentucky in the 1980s. We dug through county records, military archives, and declassified documents from the Cold War era. Slowly, piece by agonizing piece, the truth began to emerge. In 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. government had authorized the construction of a network of underground facilities designed to house essential government personnel in the event of nuclear war. Most of these facilities were well documented. Mount Weather in Virginia, Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, the bunker beneath the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. But there were others, smaller and more secretive, scattered throughout the country. The facility near Grayson, Kentucky, was codenamed Sandstone. According to the fragmented records we uncovered, Sandstone was initially built to serve as a regional command post for FEMA and military leadership. But by the mid-1970s, its purpose had evolved. It became a storage site for what the documents cryptically referred to as enhanced research materials, a euphemism that could have meant anything from classified weapons designs to biological samples to something even more disturbing. In 1983, the official records indicated that sandstone had been decommissioned and sealed. The land above it was transferred to a series of shell companies that eventually led back to a private defense contractor called Meridian Technologies. But here's the thing. Satellite imagery from the mid-1980s showed ongoing activity at the site. Trucks arriving at night. Heat signatures emanating from ventilation shafts. Electrical consumption consistent with a fully operational facility. Sandstone had never been decommissioned. It had just been hidden from public oversight. And the maps in Caleb's notebook, the ones that Sheriff Hawkins had taken and lost, had shown its exact location. The boys hadn't stumbled onto an abandoned cabin. They had stumbled onto an active secret government facility operating outside any legal framework. And someone had decided they couldn't be allowed to tell anyone about it. But here's where the story takes its first major turn. Because we assumed, for years, that the boys were dead. That they had been silenced permanently to protect the secret of sandstone. We grieved as if it were a certainty, even without bodies, even without proof. We were wrong. In 2010, we received a second anonymous message, this time as an email from a disposable account. They're alive. One of them is talking. Find Dr. Margaret Holloway. Dr. Margaret Holloway had been a psychiatrist employed by Meridian Technologies from 1985 to 1991. According to her publicly available credentials, she had specialized in psychological adaptation and recovery for personnel in high-stress environments. What this actually meant, we would soon discover, was something far more troubling. I tracked Dr. Holloway to a retirement community in Naples, Florida, where she lived alone in a modest apartment with a view of the Gulf. She was 83 years old, frail, and nearly blind from macular degeneration, but her mind was sharp as a scalpel. She knew who I was before I introduced myself. "You have his eyes," she said, gesturing for me to sit down. "Your brother. I've been waiting for someone to come asking questions. I'm surprised it took this long." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. "Dr. Holloway, I need to know what happened to those boys. I need to know if they're still alive." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the water. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They were alive when I left the facility in 1991. All four of them. I can't tell you what's happened since, but as of 20 years ago, those boys had grown into men. Trapped men. Prisoners of a project that should never have existed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything I had believed for 2 decades was crumbling and reforming simultaneously. Why? I managed to ask. Why were they kept? Why not just kill them? Dr. Holloway shook her head slowly. Because they saw something in the woods. Something that wasn't supposed to be possible. And the people running Sandstone needed to understand how they saw it, what it meant, whether others could see it too. Those boys were test subjects, Mrs. Patterson. They were prisoners of their own extraordinary minds. She wouldn't say more that day, no matter how much I pleaded. She told me to come back in 1 week, that she needed time to gather documents and make peace with what she was about to reveal. She made me promise not to go to the police, not to contact anyone, not to do anything that might alert the people who are still watching. I drove home in a daze. Marcus was waiting for me, and when I told him what I had learned, he broke down sobbing for the first time since his childhood. His brother might be alive. Our brothers might be alive. Somewhere, in some hidden facility, for boys had grown into men waiting for someone to find them. But when I returned to Naples 1 week later, Dr. Holloway was dead. The official cause was a heart attack in her sleep. Natural causes. No autopsy requested by next of kin because there was no next of kin. Her apartment had been cleaned out, every document removed, every trace of her research erased. I sat in my rental car outside her building and screamed until my throat was raw. Someone was watching. Someone was cleaning up loose ends. And we were running out of time. After Dr. Holloway's death, I became obsessed in ways that threatened to destroy everything I had built. I neglected my job, my marriage, my health. I spent nights poring over documents, chasing leads that went nowhere, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. Marcus begged me to take a break, to let the investigation rest for a few months, to come back to the land of the living. I couldn't. Because I had made a promise on that moving day in 1987, a promise to a grieving father that I would find the truth. Because my brother and his friends had been alive 4 years ago, which meant they might still be alive now. Because every day that passed was another day they spent in captivity. I quit my job at the Courier-Journal. I cashed out my retirement savings. I dedicated myself full-time to the investigation, working from a home office covered in maps and photographs and newspaper clippings. And then, in the winter of 2012, I finally found the network. It started with a podcast, a small, obscure show called Hidden Histories that focused on government cover-ups and missing persons cases. The host, a woman named Jessica Nakamura, had done an episode about a suspicious cluster of disappearances in rural Nevada that bore striking similarities to Grayson. Teenage boys vanishing during ordinary activities, botched investigations, witnesses who changed their stories, property records leading back to shell companies. I reached out to Jessica. She connected me with researchers in Texas, Montana, Virginia, and Ohio. We discovered that at least 14 groups of teenagers had disappeared near suspected underground facilities since 1970. 47 young people in total, all within a similar age range, all vanishing under circumstances that defied explanation. We weren't alone. We had never been alone. The network formed organically. Family members of the missing, investigative journalists, former military personnel who had glimpsed pieces of the truth. We called ourselves the Guardians, and we shared information through encrypted channels, meeting in person only when absolutely necessary. Among the Guardians was a man named Colonel Victor Brennan, retired, who had served in Army intelligence from 1978 to 2001. He had spent his career carefully looking the other way, but his conscience had never let him sleep soundly. Sandstone was just one node in a larger network, he told us during a clandestine meeting in a Chicago hotel room. There are facilities like it in every major geographic region of the country. They were built during the Cold War, repurposed in the 1980s, and they're still operating today under black budget funding that never appears in any congressional review. For what purpose? Jessica asked. What are they doing with these kids? Colonel Brennan hesitated. The official term in the classified documents is cognitive enhancement research. They were studying the outer boundaries of human perception, psychic phenomena, remote viewing, precognition. The kind of stuff that sounds crazy until you realize the government spent millions investigating it during projects like Stargate and Grill Flame. I thought about what Dr. Holloway had said. The boys saw something that wasn't supposed to be possible. They found subjects naturally, Brennan continued. Kids who displayed unusual abilities, unusual sensitivities. Sometimes they recruited families voluntarily, offered money for participation in studies. But when voluntary recruitment wasn't possible, he trailed off. They took them, I finished. He nodded grimly. They created circumstances, accidents, disappearances, anything that would allow them to acquire subjects without raising questions that couldn't be answered. But those facilities must have personnel, Marcus said. People who work there, who see what's happening. How can something like this stay secret for decades? Compartmentalization, security clearances, and fear. Brennan looked at each of us in turn. These people don't mess around. They've killed to protect these secrets, and they'll kill again. Every person in this room needs to understand the risk they're taking. I thought about Dr. Holloway, dying alone in her apartment. I thought about Sheriff Hawkins, taking his suspiciously generous pension and never looking back. I thought about all the witnesses who had suddenly changed their stories. Yes, I understood the risk, and I was willing to take it. Over the next 2 years, the Guardians gathered evidence. We collected testimonies, documents, photographs. We mapped the locations of suspected facilities and the networks of shell companies that owned the land above them. We built a case that, if made public, would expose one of the most egregious violations of human rights in American history. But evidence wasn't enough. We needed proof. We needed to find someone who was currently inside the system, someone who could verify that the prisoners were still alive, someone who could help us get them out. In the summer of 2014, we found that someone. Her name was Dr. Amara Osei. and she had been working at the Sandstone facility for 3 years as a psychological rehabilitation specialist. She had taken the job believing she would be helping traumatized veterans recover from PTSD. What she found instead was a horror she couldn't ignore. She reached out to us through an intermediary, terrified and determined in equal measure. There are currently 12 subjects in the Sandstone facility, she said during our first encrypted video call. 8 of them have been here for decades. 4 of them, the boys from Grayson, they're in a separate wing. They're special. The researchers call them the originals. My hands were shaking as I held the tablet. Are they okay? Are they healthy? Dr. Osei's face was pained. Physically, they're in good condition. The facility provides medical care, proper nutrition, exercise. But psychologically, she paused. They've been subjected to decades of testing, isolation, manipulation. They've been told repeatedly that their families abandoned them, that no one is looking for them, that the outside world has forgotten they exist. I felt tears streaming down my face, but didn't bother to wipe them away. Mrs. Patterson, your brother is one of the strongest people I've ever met. He's kept the others together all these years. He's never stopped believing that someone would come for them. Caleb, my quiet, steady brother, holding on to hope in a place designed to crush it. How do we get them out? Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Osei took a deep breath. I've been working on a plan, but I need to tell you something first, something you're not going to want to hear. We waited. Getting them out of the facility is possible. I've been mapping security patterns, identifying weaknesses. But the people running this program, they're connected at the highest levels. If we extract these men without exposing the entire system, without making the truth undeniable, they'll just disappear again. They'll be moved to another facility, their memories erased, and we'll never find them again. She was right. We had to do more than rescue. We had to reveal. So we go public simultaneously, Jessica said. We get them out, and we release everything. Documents, testimonies, evidence of the entire network. We make it impossible to cover up. Dr. Osei nodded. That's the only way. But it has to be perfect. One mistake, and we're all dead. And so are they. We spent the next 8 months planning the operation. Every detail, every contingency, every possible thing that could go wrong. The Guardians pooled resources, called in favors, recruited allies in unexpected places. A former NSA analyst who hated what his agency had become. A documentary filmmaker with a secure distribution network. A congressman's aide who had lost a cousin to one of the other facilities. And on March 15, 2015, we were ready. The night of the operation was cold and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds on black velvet. I remember thinking that Caleb probably hadn't seen stars in decades. The facility was underground. After all, a tomb of concrete and fluorescent light. I wondered if he remembered what they looked like. Our team consisted of 12 people, Marcus and me, Dr. Osei, Colonel Brennan, and 8 former Special Operations soldiers who had been recruited through the network. They were men who had served their country with distinction, who had believed in the institutions they fought for, and who had been sickened to learn how deeply those institutions had betrayed the values they were supposed to represent. The extraction point was a maintenance tunnel that connected the underground facility to a pumping station 2 miles away. Dr. Osei had been leaving this tunnel's security sensors in a degraded state for months, convincing maintenance staff that the equipment was old and unreliable. On the night of the operation, she would disable the sensors entirely and lead the subjects to the tunnel entrance. The soldiers would handle the external security perimeter. Marcus and I would be waiting at the pumping station with vehicles and medical supplies. Jessica and her team would be standing by to release the documents the moment we confirmed that the subjects were safe. Everything was choreographed down to the minute. We had rehearsed it dozens of times, running through scenarios, anticipating problems, building in redundancies. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. At 11:47 p.m., I received a text from Dr. Osei, compromised. They know. Abort. My blood turned to ice. I showed the message to Marcus, and I watched the color drain from his face. We can't abort, he said. If they know about Amara, they'll move the subjects tonight. We'll never find them again. He was right. There was no safe option anymore. There was only forward. I called Colonel Brennan on the secure line. They know something's wrong. We're accelerating the timeline. A pause. Then, understood. We go now. God be with us. The next 3 hours were the most terrifying of my life. Our soldiers breached the perimeter faster than anticipated, encountering less resistance than expected, which should have been a warning sign. Dr. Osei, despite the blown cover, managed to reach the subjects and lead them toward the maintenance tunnel. The internal security was chaos, guards responding to multiple alarms, confused about what was happening and where. Marcus and I waited at the pumping station, listening to fragments of communication over the radio, unable to do anything but hope and pray. At 2:23 a.m., the door of the pumping station opened, and 4 men stumbled through, blinking in the dim light of our flashlights. They were old. That was my first thought. The last time I had seen my brother, he had been 14 years old with messy brown hair and a shy smile. The man standing before me was 51, gray-haired and gaunt, with lines on his face that spoke of decades of suffering. But his eyes were the same. Emma. His voice was hoarse, disbelieving. Is it really? I couldn't speak. I could only run to him, throw my arms around him, hold him as if I could somehow protect him from the last 37 years. I never stopped looking, I whispered. I promised. I never stopped. Around us, similar reunions were happening. Marcus embraced his brother Darnell, both men crying openly. Kevin Mitchell and Ryan Foster stood together, shell-shocked, looking at a world they had been told would never welcome them again. But we didn't have time for extended reunions. The soldiers were reporting that backup was incoming, that the facility's controllers had called for reinforcements. We loaded the men into the waiting vehicles and drove into the night, toward a safe house that had been prepared months in advance. At 4:15 a.m., as our convoy crossed into Ohio, Jessica Nakamura released the documents. Every major news outlet, every government oversight committee, every social media platform simultaneously. Thousands of pages of evidence, photographs, testimonies, a cascade of truth that no one could suppress. By sunrise, the story was everywhere. Sandstone, the network, the 47 prisoners, the decades of cover-ups. Names were named: generals, senators, defense contractors who had profited from human suffering. The world woke up to a scandal that made Watergate look like a minor indiscretion. And 4 men who had disappeared on a summer bike ride in 1987 were finally coming home. The aftermath was both chaotic and cathartic. Congressional hearings were convened. FBI investigations were launched. Meridian Technologies filed for bankruptcy within weeks as contracts were canceled and executives fled the country. The network of facilities was systematically exposed and shut down, their remaining prisoners freed and reunited with families who had long since given them up for dead. Sheriff Bernard Hawkins, now 87 years old and living in Scottsdale, was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He died in prison 2 years later, never having admitted his role in the cover-up. But the legal and political dimensions were only part of the story. For me, for Marcus, for the families of the 4 boys, the real work was just beginning, helping our loved ones readjust to a world that had moved on without them. The men were damaged. There was no way they couldn't be. 37 years of captivity, of psychological manipulation, of being told that everyone they loved had forgotten them. That leaves scars that don't heal quickly. Kevin Mitchell struggled the most with the modern world. He had nightmares almost every night for the first year, would freeze in panic when he heard unexpected sounds, couldn't handle crowds or busy spaces. His parents had both passed away during his captivity, and he had no siblings, no family to return to except a handful of cousins who barely remembered him. We brought him into our family. Marcus and I had a spare room, and Kevin became something like an uncle to our children, slowly relearning how to be human in a world that had become alien to him. Darnell Patterson reunited with his father Walter, now 92 years old, and living in a nursing home in Louisville. The old man had never stopped believing his son would come home. He had kept Darnell's room ready for decades, had told anyone who would listen that the investigation had been corrupted, That powerful people had stolen his boy. When Darnell walked into that nursing home room, Walter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I knew you'd come back," he said. "I always knew." Walter died peacefully 6 months later, having finally seen his faith vindicated. Ryan Foster was reunited with his mother, who had spent years in psychiatric facilities and sober living homes, devastated by her son's disappearance and her own inability to cope. When she saw Ryan standing in her doorway, a man now instead of the teenager she had lost, she collapsed into his arms. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Ryan held her for a long time. "You couldn't have known, Mom. None of us could have known. And Caleb, my brother, my quiet, steady, extraordinary brother. He came to live with Marcus and me for the first 2 years, slowly reintegrating into the rhythms of normal life. He had to learn everything over again. How to use a smartphone, how to navigate the internet, how to exist in a world of social media and constant connection. Things that we took for granted were revelations to him. But some things hadn't changed. He still sketched in notebooks, filling pages with intricate drawings of places he had imagined during his captivity, places he wanted to visit now that he was free. He still had our mother's kindness and our father's quiet strength. He still made everyone around him feel included and valued. Our parents had both passed away during Caleb's captivity, but we took him to their graves, stood with him while he said goodbye. He cried for a long time, mourning the decades he had been robbed of, the conversations he would never have, the hugs he could never give. "They never stopped looking for you either," I told him. "Mom kept your room exactly the same until the day she died. Dad visited the woods every year on the anniversary, even when his health was failing. They loved you until their last breaths." Caleb nodded, wiping his eyes. I felt it. Even in that place, I felt them somehow. It kept me going. The facility had studied them because they had seen something impossible on that day in 1987. I finally learned what it was during one of our long evening conversations, 2 years after the extraction. "We were near the quarry," Caleb explained, staring into the middle distance. "We could see through the trees that there was this huge fence, way more security than made sense for an abandoned quarry. Kevin wanted to get closer, to see what was really there." He paused, gathering himself. There was a light. It came from underground, through what must have been ventilation shafts. But it wasn't normal light. It was, I don't know how to describe it. It was like seeing a color that shouldn't exist. We all saw it. We all felt it. Felt it. Caleb nodded. It was like something reached into our minds. Just for a moment. And then guards were everywhere, and we were running, and they caught us. The researchers at Sandstone had spent decades trying to understand what the boys had experienced, whether it was a psychic phenomenon, an effect of some unknown technology, or something else entirely. They had tested and probed and analyzed, never quite finding the answers they sought. But for the 4 men who had survived that experience, the meaning was simpler. "We knew," Caleb said. "From that moment, we knew we had seen something true, something that the people keeping us prisoner were afraid of. And that knowledge, it was what kept us sane. We knew we weren't crazy. We knew we were right." 3 years after the extraction, when the legal proceedings had mostly concluded and the media attention had faded, Kevin Mitchell stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered testimony that would be studied in universities for decades to come. He was nervous, we could all see it. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the gravity of the moment was overwhelming. But as he began to speak, something shifted. The uncertainty fell away, replaced by the steady confidence of a man who had survived the unsurvivable and emerged with his integrity intact. "I spent 37 years as a prisoner of my own government," Kevin said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I was 14 years old when I was taken. I'm 51 now, and I'm standing here today not for revenge, not for compensation, but for accountability." The chamber was silent, every eye fixed on the gray-haired man at the podium. There are children in this country who disappeared under similar circumstances and were never found. Some of them may still be alive, in facilities we haven't discovered yet. Some of them died without ever seeing the sun again. All of them were failed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Kevin looked around the room. meeting the eyes of senators and representatives who had built careers on promises of transparency and justice. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for us. We survived. We're here. What I'm asking is that you make sure this never happens again. That you close every loophole that allowed these programs to exist outside the law. That you prosecute every person who enabled these abuses. And that you never forget that your power comes with the sacred obligation to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. He paused, gathering himself for the final statement. My friends and I had one thing in common. We believed in this country. We believed that truth would prevail, that the good would overcome the bad, that our families would never stop looking for us. We were right, but we were also lucky. Lucky that my sister Emma never gave up. Lucky that good people risked everything to help us. Lucky that the system eventually worked. Kevin's voice cracked with emotion. I'm asking you to make sure the next group of kids who stumble onto something they shouldn't see doesn't have to rely on luck. They deserve to rely on you. The applause that followed was thunderous. Senators wept openly. Even hardened political observers admitted it was one of the most powerful moments of congressional testimony in living memory. In the months that followed, sweeping legislation was passed to increase oversight of classified programs, to protect whistleblowers, to create independent review boards for any project involving human subjects. The Mitchell-Patterson Accountability Act bore our families' names, a permanent reminder of what happens when power operates without transparency. But the most meaningful victory, for those of us who had lived through the ordeal, was simpler. We were believed. After decades of being dismissed as conspiracy theorists, of being told we were crazy or paranoid or grief-stricken, the world finally acknowledged what we had always known. The truth was stranger than fiction. The cover-up was real, and the boys had been stolen. The summer of 2024 was warm and golden, the kind of summer that makes you believe in the goodness of the world. I was 63 years old, with gray hair of my own now and grandchildren who knew their great-uncle Caleb as the quiet artist who always had time for their stories. The four men, Kevin, Darnell, Ryan, and Caleb, had decided to mark the anniversary of their disappearance with a return to Grayson, Kentucky. They hadn't been back since the extraction. None of them had been ready. But now, somehow they were. Marcus and I drove them into town on a July morning that felt impossibly similar to that day 37 years ago. The community had changed in some ways. New buildings, new businesses, the coal industry long since replaced by healthcare and education. But the bones of the town were the same. The streets they had ridden on their bicycles. The corner where Mrs. Donovan had watched them disappear over the hill. Mrs. Donovan had passed away in 2019, but her granddaughter still lived in the corner house with the garden gnomes on the lawn. She was waiting for us when we arrived, having heard through the community grapevine that the Grayson Four, as the media had taken to calling them, were coming home. I grew up hearing the story, she said, embracing each of them in turn. My grandmother never stopped feeling guilty for not stopping you that day. She always said she should have made you come inside for lemonade, should have delayed you somehow. Kevin shook his head. She waved at us. That's what I remember. A friendly wave from a woman we barely knew. That memory got me through some dark days. Please tell her family we're grateful. We visited the memorial that had been erected in the town square after the story broke. A bronze statue of four boys on bicycles, captured in that moment of joyful anticipation. The inscription read, "For Kevin, Darnell, Ryan, and Caleb." Taken in 1987. Found in 2015. Never forgotten. Caleb stood before the statue for a long time, studying his 14-year-old face frozen in bronze. That kid had no idea what was coming, he said quietly. But he also had no idea what he was capable of surviving. I wish I could tell him it's going to be okay. Maybe you just did, I said, taking his hand. The final stop was the most important, the woods themselves. The sandstone facility had been sealed and destroyed, the land restored to something resembling its natural state. Where there had once been razor wire and guard towers, there were now wildflowers and young trees reaching toward the sky. The four men walked into those woods together, following paths that had been carved by their memories and their trauma. Marcus and I hung back, giving them space for whatever they needed to do. They were gone for almost 3 hours. When they emerged, their faces were calm, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen before. Something had been released, some burden finally laid down. We said goodbye, Darnell explained. To the boys we were, to the years we lost, to all of it. And we said thank you, Ryan added. To everyone who kept looking, to everyone who refused to let us be forgotten. Kevin put his arms around his brothers. That's what they had become, after everything, brothers in every way that mattered. We're free now, he said. Really free. Not just physically. We're free. That evening, we gathered at a local restaurant for dinner with families and friends and community members who wanted to welcome them home. There were speeches and toasts and tears of joy. There was music and laughter and storytelling late into the night. And when the moon rose over Grayson, Kentucky, casting silver light on streets that had once been shadowed by grief and suspicion, I looked around the room at the faces of the people I loved. My brother Caleb, talking animatedly with his nieces and nephews about art and adventure. Darnell, dancing with his elderly father in a wheelchair, both of them laughing. Ryan, entertaining a group of children with magic tricks he had taught himself during captivity. Kevin, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the town that had shaped him. I thought about the 12-year-old girl who had made a promise to Walter Patterson on a gray morning in 1987. She had spent her entire adult life honoring that promise. She had faced ridicule and danger and despair. She had almost lost her marriage, her career, her sanity. But she had never given up. And neither had the 4 boys who had ridden into the woods on that summer afternoon. That's the real story. Not the scandal or the conspiracy or the decades of cover-up. The real story is about ordinary people who refuse to accept lies, who keep pushing against walls that everyone says can't be moved, who love each other fiercely enough to fight the entire system. The real story is about hope. If you've made it this far, then you understand something important. Truth matters. The people we love matter. And no matter how powerful the forces aligned against us, we always have the choice to keep searching, keep believing, keep fighting. My brother is free. His friends are free. And the truth, after 37 years in darkness, is finally living in the light. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not scrolling away. And please, if this story moved you, share it. Subscribe to this channel. Because every person who hears this story becomes part of the network of truth seekers, the community of people who refuse to let the powerful hide their crimes. There are still secrets out there. Still people waiting to be found. Still stories waiting to be told. And together, we can bring them all home.